And it's nice to have you here. And if you would like to be on our mailing list, we'll put a pad out here. Please put your email address, and you will get spammed with all our events. It's very nice to have Maureen Orth here. This is an acorn falling not far from the tree because she, after all, went to Berkeley. She's a reporter that I have long followed and enjoyed, who has combined good investigative reporting with very topical subjects, some having to do with pop culture, which we were just discussing earlier, is something that is really occupying more and more of the space in all of our lives. And this book that she's just done, The Importance of Being Famous, really deals with the way in which the whole question of celebrity and fame has come to stake a claim on the world of journalism. I think particularly in television, but also to some degree in magazines, the tabloids. And I think it raises a very interesting question of ultimately what will the effect of this gathering force of fixation on fame and celebrity be on what we've traditionally thought of as serious journalism. I think sometimes it seems almost as if those who are doing, quote, serious journalism are allowed to do it in some form or other, but are almost relegated to a sandbox, a kind of a ghettoized, if you will, where one, I think, has to finally ask, you know, how much effect is this fourth estate, which in the conception of this country was to play a very important role as a check and balance in the political process? How important are we? Or are we sort of dismissed as the nattering nabobs of negativism, as one very great vice president long ago once described us? So Maureen's going to talk a little bit about this. She's a longtime writer at Vanity Fair, over 10 years. She did stints at Vogue, at Newsweek. This is your second book, Maureen?
Yes.
And it's just come out. And I must say it is incredibly timely. And it is, nobody is better equipped than she to address this sort of other strange sibling of journalism, which has been so indelibly dyed by fame and celebrity. So, Maureen. And then we'll open it to questions. She'll speak a bit, and we'd love to have a discussion.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm really happy to be here because I know so many of you, and I feel like very much like I'm home. So you can think of me as just nattering. I'm not going to be a nattering nabob of negativism. By the way, that I believe that phrase was coined by Pat Buchanan and written. No, he wrote it for Agnew. Anyway, my book, The Importance of Being Famous, actually came about because a number of people had approached me to put the various profiles I had done in Vanity Fair for the last 15 years together in one place, because I've really written about everybody from Madonna to Margaret Thatcher, from Vladimir Putin and Jerry Adams to Michael Jackson and Woody Allen, and it's a kind of a strange, long grouping of people who have in common the fact that they are extremely recognized or extremely famous. And I think that we live in an era now of everything really is going to an extreme one way or another. And so a little over a year ago, I was assigned by Vanity Fair, it certainly was nothing I ever chose to write about, to come to Modesto to do the Laci Peterson case. And I thought, how am I, a single reporter on my own without a phalanx of, I mean, People magazine and the newspapers, they send huge teams of people to just camp out in a place and try to cover the story day in and day out, week after week. So when I got to Modesto, which I had remembered from my childhood as being this sleepy little agricultural town, I was absolutely amazed to see these huge trucks from all the TV networks with their satellites jutting up into the air, antennas, and within a 2 or 3 block area of the Stanislaus County Courthouse, this just whir of the generators from these trucks. And inside these trucks were very sophisticated, complete TV studio control rooms. And these were actually portable TV studios that could beam anywhere in the world. And indeed, they were. And near these trucks, in front of for a whole block and a half of the courthouse was cordoned off, and there were all these white tents. And they were like, I thought of them, they filled up twice a day usually with all these talking heads. And so you would see simultaneously these white tents with all these people with microphones talking all at once, with these generators roaring in the background and these big satellite trucks. And I thought, whoa, this is bizarre. And it reminded me, it was bizarre, and it reminded me of a media bazaar. And so I thought, the real story what's really going on here is, to me, so much of the difference between the reality of what I am seeing and this very small controlled picture that you are seeing as viewers on television. The reality that they are putting forth to you is not at all like the reality that I am observing. I want to show you the process of how this works. And it occurred to me after I finished doing the reporting for this piece, in which the tabloid reporters who paid for sources but were really the people who got beyond the block in front of the courthouse and really did the footwork while they were also paying off the sources, were the leaders in terms of the reporting. And a lot of the people just followed what they said. It occurred to me that this really was what I thought of as the celebrity industrial complex, because what we have now is ever more monopolistic and congregated media empires, which go from book publishing to cable television to network television. And what you're seeing now is really the face of journalism is changing tremendously, or it's already begun, or it has changed. What you're seeing now is, if you are a celebrity of the moment, whether you're Michael Jackson or Madonna or Jessica Lynch, it is no longer enough just to have a 60 Minutes interview or all of the Dateline show devoted to you. What's going on right now is Jessica Lynch was offered not only a 60 Minutes interview by Viacom, which owns CBS. At the same time, she was offered a book deal from Simon & Schuster, which they also own. She was offered a VH1 concert show in her hometown. She was offered something on MTV, and she was offered a movie of the week. And this was the package that was presented to her if she would go with CBS. And in the end, she didn't choose Simon & Schuster. She chose Knopf, which is one of the most venerable publishing houses. And since I'm on Jessica Lynch, I'll just go on and talk about her a little bit, because we so often think of celebrity journalism and it's Michael Jackson, or it's somebody, Britney Spears, or Paris Hilton, or whatever. In this case, you have to understand that the same techniques that are being used for Paris Hilton or Omarosa or this whole idea of fame and infamy merging is also being used by the Pentagon to sell the war with Jessica Lynch. She was the poster child who rallied the country at the moment the war began to really support this war. And the myth of her firing her gun till the very end, and then ending up in a hospital with the kindness of an Iraqi lawyer, and then being dramatically rescued. That was the myth. And it was on the front page of the Washington Post, and that's exactly what it was. It was a myth. Yes, she got dramatically rescued. We don't know if the lawyer helped her, because she doesn't remember that, and she doesn't remember anything that happened to her, and she never fired her gun because she kept her head in her lap the whole time, crouched down, and she probably couldn't fire her gun because she didn't clean it properly. And so she was not the heroine, although obviously anybody who gets wounded the way she did and tries to recover it, et cetera, I'm not saying is not an admirable person, but she was not the myth that had been created. And the Washington Post did not correct that story. It was only the foreign media that began to question it in the first place. And the Washington Post never corrected that story for 2 months. And when it was time for her book to be published, which she had gotten $1 million for, what were they going to say if she couldn't remember anything and if the myth weren't true? Well, her publisher, Alfred Knopf, said she might have been raped during that time that she can't remember. But she couldn't remember that, which prompted the reviewer from the Philadelphia Inquirer to ask whether or not they were using rape as a marketing tool. So that's the kind of society we are living in now, where fame and infamy are merging, and we have people who are becoming famous simply because the camera lands on them, and the camera does not distinguish whether somebody ought to be famous. I mean, the traditional idea is you become famous for achievement or talent or heroics or something. But now we are a society in which anybody who does something extreme, usually sexual or violent or whatever, can become famous. And there is more and more media time that is being devoted to this. And if you really look at what's going on, the traditional firewall between entertainment and news is merging, or is burning down, or whatever the metaphor might be. And you have people who are being celebrated just because they've done something. And we're living in an era in which you have to become more and more extreme in order to get attention. Now, why is this? It's because there's so much competition with a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week news cycle, and so much competition from these conglomerates and these media sources. And you also have the wired world of the internet, in which none of the traditional checks and balances of regular journalism are applied. So this is this world where that's all revved up, that's much, much faster, and things go by much more in a blur, and people are consumed, and celebrities' shelf life is a lot faster than it might have been. So therefore, those who are able to command your attention and those who break out of the pack are worth a great deal more than they used to be, and therefore they can also demand more. And what we have now are, I think, a generation of younger people growing up with the idea that they watch MTV where people are going through plastic surgery. I want a famous face. They're going through plastic surgery to look like somebody famous. And so traditional journalism is, I believe, really not keeping up the way it should in order to chronicle all this. Because if you have, it's much easier to cover politics as scandal. It's much easier just to go on and on for 10 days straight about what Condi Rice is going to say before the 9/11 Commission than to have to go report what's actually going on the ground in Iraq. And I think that it really, this emphasis on personality and this emphasis on fame really infects all different parts of journalism. And I think that being extremely famous is really very much of a shield for a lot of people. I have covered Michael Jackson, for example, four times over 10 years. I probably have devoted more time to him than almost any other reporter. And he is a person who began with tremendous amount of talent, and that talent sort of almost gave him a godlike appearance to millions and millions of people around the world, so that when he got into trouble, he was believed a lot more than anybody who was accusing him. And I think that that what has happened is that most people are so willing to take the spin of the celebrity versus the person who might be doing the accusing. Especially on television today, you see the syndrome where the defense is the side that gets all the airtime, because of course that is their job, to define the accuser to you, just as it's George Bush's job to define John Kerry and John Kerry's job to define George Bush. So what is going on now is that you are seeing these huge, these celebrity trials. At least Michael Jackson is famous. Lacey Peterson isn't even famous. So I say in my piece about Laci Peterson, you don't have to be famous anymore to be famous. And when but in her case, one of the CNN reporters working on the story, I said, how is it that this commands so much time? Well, guess what? She said, well, they don't have any tattoos. So Scott and Laci were very good-looking young Californians. They were supposedly living the good life. What happened? Could he possibly have done it? Somebody that looks like this? And so it just goes on from there. And there's a very savvy grief counselor who's one of the pivotal people in the whole drama, a woman who had experience with other missing people before, and she became the gatekeeper to get to Laci's family, and they went and passed a law in Washington, as you know, recently, and they have a website, and so now there's all these accoutrements to having these major cases that you have never seen before. And a lot of this is simply just grown up without anybody really talking about it enough or investigating it. And I see examples of this, just to jump around. 10 years ago, when Michael Huffington was running for the Senate in California, I did a big investigative piece on Michael and Arianna Huffington, and I will stand up and tell you that Arianna Huffington is probably the most ruthless, opportunistic person I have ever encountered in all of my time in journalism, and I have to tell you, that's saying something. And she has been in the thrall of a guru named John Roger for at least over 20 years. Even if you saw in the last gubernatorial campaign, she paid no income taxes virtually, but she gave $6,800 to John Roger. She is a soul initiate, which is the highest level of his particular cult. He considers himself the preceptor consciousness, who only comes on earth every 25,000 years. And she's supposed to invoke his name in prayer 3 times a day. Well, did you read about this when she was running for governor? The media, I don't know where they are. They're asleep at the wheel. If you do real investigative journalism about these people, you find out these things. And so I think that while everybody laments the idea that, oh my God, we're living in this era of personalities and celebrity and fluff, it also behooves the journalists here to get beyond the superficial and get beyond the spin and have to really do the legwork and the research and the hard work it takes to get the real story. And that's where I think I will end for questions.
Do you think that media outlets really do want people like you and me to do the kind of investigative journalism that you seem to suggest is necessary? Or do you think there's a shrinking demand for it?
Well, it's interesting that you ask. All I know is that every time I do one of these pieces, I'm asked to be on practically every single television show to talk about it. My stories get hugely picked up by the rest of the media, so I guess there is some interest in it. I don't know how else to answer that.
Well, what's going on here then is at the same time, investigative journalism seems to be a dying breed. There seems to be less time, money, space, funds to do the kinds of things that I think, you do something, you do three, 4 months.
Right.
These are not easy stories to do.
No, I think an analogy I would make is that, like, for example, I think it was in the year 2000. It was whenever George Bush appeared in Boston Harbor, and then it was when the TV networks were beginning to take photo ops of the candidates and just running them without any commentary and just taking how the campaign was defining the candidate instead of saying, wait a minute, step back. I think you can still, if you're going to see Michael Jackson, who is so addicted to fame that he dangles his baby over a balcony in order to get more of a rise out of the crowd, or he steps on the hood of an SUV after he's been arraigned for child molestation, I think you really can use that footage, but why don't you use that footage and say, wait a minute, let's talk about pedophilia here. What are the signs of it? What are the classic traits of personality that do this? I mean, when you have all the defense lawyers trying to trash the accusers, why don't you talk about the kind of people that real pedophiles target? They don't target nuclear families with strong, two-parent backgrounds. They move where they think they can create a wedge. So I think there's ways to do it, and I think just a lot of journalists don't think them up, or they're too lazy.
One more thing, and then I don't want to monopolize this. Do you think it is the fault of the journalist or the fault of the way the world of journalism is constructed that precludes us from doing the kinds of things
Well,
you're suggesting?
What's happened is since we've become wired relatively recently, I think, and that this really intense competition of 24/7 cables hasn't really been going on that long. Everybody is still really going after the same audiences, and so the competition is so intense, they're trying to sort of give the cotton candy because it's a lot easier to cover, there's a lot more space to fill, and if it's really hard to know. It's that chicken or the egg thing. Is it because people are just given a steady diet of this is what they want? Or is it because they haven't been given anything, is there anything else to give them and they may change? But right now it's all about the ratings. Right now it's all about how can you get the 18 to 49-year-old audience. The networks are worried because they're worried that they're going to be losing this audience just as newspapers are. And so I think they have to think about it a lot more than they are. Anybody else want to ask me some questions? Tora?
Yeah, I wondered, you said that the tabloids get, like, for instance, with Arnold or with Ariana, they do all the investigative reporting and stuff, and that is, well, or at least what I thought you said was that maybe some of the more respected journals, like the Times or the Boston Globe or something like that, wait until those things come out in these tabloids. Could that be about snobism in journalism?
Well, that's an interesting question. Is it about snobism, or is it just about being lazy and not just getting out there and having to do the work? I think one of the real dangers in journalism today among young journalists is that they think downloading is journalism. They think that if they just sit there behind the computer screen all day long and they get all this other information, that somehow takes the place of going out and doing the footwork. I just happen to be a very old-fashioned kind of reporter. You got to get out there and hit the street and find people. You got to knock on doors and ring doorbells. It's hideous work. It really is, but that's how you get the story. Chris?
Well, I think also when you have a monthly, it allows you that,
Right.
which is wonderful because you have 3 months to develop a story.
Right.
And so you are considered one of the great journalists because I know you and I know how you have sourced stories. And I know Orville, you can attest to this, when we were at the Yorker, we had 17 fact checkers. How many do you think they have today? How many does Newsweek have today? Those are weeklies. So then you get into electronic media, you're dealing with the immediacy and the one-upmanship of getting the newspaper out the next day, but also getting on air and having that
Right.
story on air before the other guy gets on air. So I think each media presents its own set of problems, but the advantage I think that you have and why you are such a great journalist is because you have that opportunity to really delve into a story and get the real story behind the story, which is...
There's no doubt that daily journalism, and you've got to hit the air, is a much tougher assignment than having the time to develop things.
Are there fact checkers now? I have no idea about the business now. So are there fact checkers now at weeklies?
Most magazines.
Yeah. Well, I think Tom...
That's what I heard.
Oh, my God. Well, had no idea. Vanity Fair is very extensive in fact checking. Yes, Randy.
I've heard that the European press is presenting the war in Iraq in a very different way than the American press. I don't know which is right, but assuming it appears from the comments that are coming from people who have access to that the United States government is in effect controlling what the American press generally, in all media, newspaper, television, are giving us as to what's going on. How's that happening and how bad is it?
I have lived in Washington quite a long time now, since 1989, and I am not a Washington journalist that's out there and doing those stories every day, but my sense is that this particular White House has the most tightly controlled message that I have ever seen. in Washington. And I think embedding journalists was kind of a brilliant idea from their point of view, because when you're living and sleeping and on the road in those horrible conditions, you definitely identify. It's like the Stockholm Syndrome. You know, you identify with the people that you're living with and maybe facing death with. So I think that I've just recently been out of the country a couple of times and even watched CNN headline news, which is vastly different than what we see here at home. And there is a much, I think this whole controversy, for example, over whether we show pictures of the coffins is really, they're saying, if you notice how the White House gauges it, it's all about whether or not we are going to be respectful of the families. I really think, and everybody sort of reports it that way, but isn't really a question also to ask, they just don't want us to see how many people are dying there? Yes, David.
Yeah, there's sort of a, in a lot of media today, where there's sort of like a thing where as long as a point and a counterpoint are presented, as long as, you know, you've got the pro side and the con side, that's accepted as the truth, but it's not necessarily the truth. I mean, if I say the ceiling is white and you say it's black, it doesn't mean it's gray.
Well, I think increasingly, that's a very good point, because I think increasingly the dialogue is stated as controversy, point, counterpoint, and it's all about opinion. So if you see the amount of, quote, opinion that's masquerading as news, it's a huge amount. I don't know if anybody's ever measured it, but increasingly, particularly on the internet, that's what you're getting. You're getting people's opinions and venting as opposed to really an analysis of the facts. Yes. Yes, Neil.
Why are the news media obeying that directive from the government not to take pictures of the wounded or the...
I guess because they're afraid of being, you know, I'm really not the right person. I'm not an authority on this. I think they're afraid of being frozen out, and the competition is so tough that they can't risk that. That might be one of the reasons. Mm-hmm. Yes?
I'm wondering, can you talk a little bit more about your international profilees like Putin and Jerry Adams, and
Sure.
how you work with those and how you make them interesting to
Yes, I would be happy. I think that there's really kind of almost no better assignment to have than to be able to go abroad with the assignment that you're supposed to do a head of state, and say you're there with Vanity Fair and you want to interview a head of state.
What does Putin say to something like that?
Well, let me tell you what happened with Putin, because I went over there right at the time that he was first being elected, and one of the most interesting things was, here was Putin, who was a obscure KGB agent who kept landing as the assistant to all these more powerful people. And while he was the assistant to the mayor of Leningrad, he was dubbed the Gray Cardinal, because he had such a great grasp of details, and his number one attribute was loyalty. He absolutely obeyed the boss. Now, Boris Yeltsin was an extremely unpopular leader of Russia. He embarrassed the Russians because he drank too much, and he made a fool of himself on a number of occasions, and they were already deeply wounded by having lost their empire and having the whole sort of the collapse of communism. They're very highly educated people, so they wanted somebody that they could respect. And yet Yeltsin was not going to allow anybody to take over that he and, quote, the family, which was kind of this mafia that was running the country, didn't want to take over. So they really did one of the most brilliant marketing jobs that I have ever seen. There was a character of an old Russian movie named Sturlitz, who was a KGB guy, and he was extremely loyal to Mother Russia, but he was always, you know, a paragon of rectitude. And so they started casting Putin as if he were Sturlitz, and that he was really this mole inside the Yeltsin government who was going to make everything all right again. And it worked. And they made him very macho. Remember, they sent him to Chechnya, where he was wielding the knife and said he was going to cut him off at the you-know-what if the terrorists didn't stop. And they practiced all the same arts as you see if you're going to practically market a movie. And that's how one of the big ways they got him elected. So when I go there, you just, my key to Putin was going to Leningrad, where he grew up, and I had heard that he was a wrestler. So I went to the old gym where he learned to wrestle as a little boy, and I found his coach, who became like a second father to him. And I interviewed him, and that was sort of a key to me to his character, because he was so secretive and everything. And from there, after I had talked to that man, who they never let talk to any other reporters after that, I told him not to, and then I kind of went out from there and sort of talked. It's interesting, when people are victorious, they often want to brag to you how they've done it and how they won. And as long as you do have the time to be on both ends of it, sometimes you get interesting information that way. But I never, when I go to a country to talk to somebody, I always just try to look for, I try to look at all levels of society, not just the officials, but somebody like the wrestling coach, somebody that knows the person for a long time, and just, I spend a tremendous amount of time trying to get to that person. I don't want the usual talking heads that you might see. You have to go talk to them too, but usually they're the same as you would find in Washington. That's one of the most interesting things when you go abroad and you start to go to all these different countries. The kind of categories of people are very much alike in different countries, and so you sort of learn who's valuable or worthwhile and who isn't, just by instinct after experience. Yes?
Yeah, I want to ask two small questions. One is, who defines news? You're talking about whether what you're feeding to people, whether that's news or there's something else. I'll give you an example. For example, in London, there are two newspapers. There's Guardian, there's Sun. Everybody knows that Sun is sensational. These are all lies. But Sun sells more than Guardian. And what people actually want, whether the news, the definition of news is what people want, or whether the definition of news is, we decide, a journalist decides. And the second question is, you are at a level of your career where you can actually speak your mind, because if your news, your magazine checks you out, you will have 20 more places. For example, there are people who are working for newspapers who have real problem. If they lose the job, they'll not get the other job. And news outlets are controlled by, for example, Rupert Murdoch, who has a newspaper in London, who has a newspaper in the United States, who has a TV channel in India, and there are, for example, editors. I'm talking of India. There are editors who are, for example, editor Delhi Market. So, the managers have taken over the role of the editors, because news is a commodity now.
Yes.
So, how will you, in this situation, how will you define and how will you blame, reporters not to do extra work?
Well, I think that's a good point, because to me, really, Rupert Murdoch really began the Fleet Streetization of the American media, and he's been tremendously successful at it. And he and maybe Tina Brown earlier at Vanity Fair have imported a lot of those techniques that do emphasize scandal and personality, etc. If you're a young reporter and you don't have freedom to do what you want, but you have to put food on the table, I think that's very difficult. I really don't have a good answer for that. How do you get around it other than try to find another place to work at some point? But it isn't easy, and I'm not suggesting that it is. I'm just suggesting that a lot of times in this country particularly, I think we just kind of fall into ways of doing things or reporting things without, they just happen and all of a sudden they're fixed when they haven't been examined perhaps enough. Yes?
So I really like this question because I think it involves ethical norms in your industry.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I'm wondering if you think there's adequate leadership within to act as a counterbalance to these pressures that you're all feeling.
I hope.
Come from somewhere else.
Well, considering all the scandals we have in the corporate community today and in different parts of our society, I was really struck by how incredibly candid USA Today was last week when they wrote these huge pieces about the reporter that they had, Jack Kelly, who had plagiarized. And their mea culpa was way beyond anything I have read, certainly from corporate America. And similarly, it took the New York Times a long time to come clean, but when they did, they lost their editor, and USA editors today had also rolled, and they said there are more to come. So I think that at least in these two instances of plagiarism that were very egregious, both of these news organizations went way beyond what other institutions in our society have done to rectify themselves.
And what about just raising the bar in terms of looking beyond ratings for just everyday coverage?
I think it's Pollyanna-ish to assume that you can look beyond ratings when you're trying to turn out something. But what I'm saying is, if you're creative, there are other ways. You are sort of confined within a context or a box, but there's other creative ways. Because journalism runs on ideas. That is the currency of journalism. Your creativity, your ability to articulate, to see a story a certain way. No one is ever going to turn down a good idea. I don't care who you work for, okay? If you're creative, if you're enterprising, if you have good ideas, you can get your stuff done. And I think that that's just, he's saying no. Well, only my experience is in this country. I'm sorry, I haven't worked in India, I haven't worked in other places, but
I'll give you an example. For example, you go to Iraq, you will definitely, because I can understand how journalists can be like computers. Whatever you feed them, they will not be human beings. They have come up from, for example, if you are born in New York, you lived in America, you have your family, and you have seen this culture, you've grown up in this culture. Your way of looking at things will be different from my look at things, because I'm from a different culture, and the way I will look at things is different. So I think there is a selective truth. We all are. There's nothing which is black and white. So the issue is, what I was trying to ask is, the media outlets are much more, they're becoming much more commercialized. The advertisement is much more important. If you have a 900-word story, it will be cut into 500-word story if there's an ad on the front page. That happens all the time. So I was just thinking why people expect journalists to be, like the crusaders. Why we are also employees. We also work for monthly salary.
Because I think a lot of times people who go into journalism can make a lot more money other places, but they choose a profession in which there are somewhat different values expected of them, and they have more creativity, and they have the ability to move around more. Your point about cultural sensitivity, I think, is extremely important, and I think that that's something we need a lot more of. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Colombia for 2 years. That was so important to me as a journalist, to learn another language, to live in another country, to learn to get along with whatever situation you were thrown in, at whatever level. And I think that if you have those kinds of experiences when you're very young, it really does help you to have more empathy. And empathy is really one of the most valuable assets to have in journalism, because you have to understand where the other person is coming from, whether or not you agree with them. And I think that's one of the things that's bothering me a little bit about this Iraq war coverage. And I see us like forgetting that, or not thinking that what the other people who may not agree with us think has any validity. And that's unfortunate. I think I'll just take a couple of more questions because I'm wilting. Yes?
I'm curious about what you see as the greater dangers of this celebrity industrial complex, because it seems to me like it can go in. Well, it's dangerous on so many different levels.
It is very dangerous. For example, we're pushing the envelope right now on checkbook journalism. We haven't gotten there yet. We need a big break on that. In other words, the New York Times reports that Michael Jackson gets $1 million extra for his special and he's going to, but before they can air the special, he must go on 60 Minutes and explain himself. A word by any other name is? What do you call that? CBS says, well, you know, he's going to explain himself. Other people could say that's checkbook journalism. I think that we're at a point now where we haven't quite gone over the line, but we're approaching it rapidly. That's why we need to be educated consumers. I think that the line between entertainment and news is blurring. Certainly the line between fame and infamy has already kind of gone. But as people who are being trained to be journalists, who are people who are decision makers about what's going to get on the front page, what's going to get on the air, how are you going to do your stories, you've got to be very aware of all that. And I think we still have time to make sure that certain things don't happen, but we really are in a very dangerous moment.
Maureen, I don't want to sound like your husband, but isn't the real question not whether it was checkbook journalism at CBS, but why does CBS want to put Michael Jackson on at all?
Exactly. Well, he got 7 hours of prime time in 1 week. I think in the year. I can't remember if it's the balcony dangling or if it's the the latest charges, but he got all of this time, and they're almost like lemmings. If one has them, then the other has them, and then can they have them? But the ratings, I guess, are good enough that they actually there just doesn't seem to be a saturation point. I frankly don't understand how people. Well, you also have to understand something. The ratings are so low in cable. The highest rated cable show, which is Larry King and Bill O'Reilly, I think, they have about 1.2 to 1.4 million viewers a night. Tina Brown was getting 70,000. I'm thinking most of these, like Greta Van Susteren, they're getting less than 1 million viewers a night. So if you're in a society of 300 million people, that's not very many. But it creates a certain tableau because simply that's what the air is being filled with. So, yes?
What's your favorite profile in this book?
Well, let's see. I have several. I like Karl Lagerfeld, who Katrina was my editor at Vanity Fair. Was
That's
one of
the
my.
right answer, Maureen.
He was a great character. And he really understood how to manipulate the press, but he always did it with a wink, and he was highly ironic, and he stayed on top for over 20 years in a very bitchy, backbiting business. And I really love to see how he did what he did. I got a great kick out of watching Carlos Menem of Argentina when he first was elected president. I remember when the first time I ever saw him, he was dressed up like the Red Baron. They were trying to sell some fighter jets to the United States, and he was riding in the back of a 2-seater thing, and he landed, and and he was wearing the scarf and everything, and as he descended, there were 2 white-gloved waiters on either side, depending on which side he would turn to quaff a glass of champagne to celebrate his flight. And then instead of getting into the official presidential car, a big sports car pulled up to the runway, and he got in, and there was this rickety old ambulance that was supposed to follow him if he got into a wreck. And the guy who was driving me turned around to me and says, it's the country who needs the ambulance. And that was my first impression of Menem. And then his top assistant said to me, well, when we did the campaign, the 2 books we most followed were Machiavelli and Being There. So I also thought that was pretty instructive. So I love Carlos Menem, not because I admired him, but just because he was so much fun to cover. I love Karl Lagerfeld, a very graceful, beautiful woman who I close the book with is the great ballerina Margot Fonteyn, because she had given up fame. She had had thousands of roses strewn at her feet for years and years, thousands and thousands of curtain calls, and she married a very, very difficult man who became paralyzed from an assassination attempt. He was a Panamanian politician, and she had to dance all over the world for years beyond what she wanted to support him. And every time she left the country, he would take up with his much younger mistress. And on the day he died, the mistress committed suicide. And I never wrote that because I didn't want to hurt Margot Fontaine. And I really think that I probably wouldn't be able to get away with that today. And she was a woman of great grace and beauty who was living in this little farmhouse with a tin roof in Panama and with chickens in the front yard. And she never regretted a moment of what had happened to her because she said that she never wanted to have to live. She said, I have spent too many years of my life in the empty hotel room. And therefore, I end the book with her because she was such a paragon to me of beauty, wisdom, grace, everything. And that's how I'll end with you. Thank you. Oh, I always forget, but I have a website called MaureenOrth.com, and you can get up on the website and read a lot more about the book. Thank you.
Can I say one thing before you leave? Because
Yeah.
the degree that this woman knows her material and does research. I spoke 2 days after, or a day after Versace was killed. I was talking to Maureen on the phone, and she literally told me, or she didn't tell me, but she said to me, I know who killed him. And I need to get hold of the FBI. I need to find out who it is. And she knew before the police or the FBI that it was Andrew. I will never forget that as long as I live. And I followed it in the paper saying, but why don't they call him? And you ended up, I guess, going down and helping them. But that's the degree of research she does on her story.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for coming.
Do you have the book? Or are you going to?
No, there's like a page. There's usually in this tab.
It wasn't about